Hello, and thank you very much for tuning in to the podcast series by the New Silk Road Project. I'm your host today, Charles Stevens, the founder of the New Silk Road Project. This series is dedicated to understanding and raising awareness of one of the most important development strategies of the 21st century, China's Belt and Road Initiative. The centerpiece of the New Silk Road Project, an initiative supported by JEEP, CSIS, Magellan Capital, the University of St Andrews and Shira, was to travel the course of the Silk Road economic belt from London to Yiwu in eastern China, interviewing the key actors and academics along its course. We will have to apologise in advance for some of the tangential moments in this podcast series, and also the variable quality of audio footage. We do hope this series sheds important light into China's growing global presence and the significant changes taking place across Eurasia. Our drive from Hungary to Serbia took us parallel to the Budapest-Belgrade railway line. Our stop in Belgrade was brief, but we were lucky enough to be able to speak to Milos Damnjanovic, the head of research and analysis at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. He provided some insight into the corruption in the region, also linked with China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's presence. Due to the nature of his work, he couldn't disclose a huge amount, but what he did disclose was extremely interesting.
My background, academically, my background is in democratization studies. I did a master's and a DPhil at Oxford at St Anthony's College, which looked at democratization in Serbia and Croatia during the 1990s, and especially the role of external actors, primarily Western countries, EU countries, and the US in supporting democratization in this region.
Okay, and there seems to be a tension between funding which the EU provides and also more Eastern bodies like 16+1. Do you see this as the increasing investment from China is threatening the agenda of the EU, or is this not a problem?
I don't see it as necessarily being a threat yet, but certainly Serbia's main proclaimed foreign policy goal and orientation is joining the European Union. China is an international superpower which is rising, and it pursues its own goals and agendas. It is not aligned with the EU's goals and agendas in the region, and that's natural. China doesn't have to align its goals and its interests in the region with those of the EU. But for a country like Serbia, I think it needs to be cognizant of this, and it needs to simply keep in focus what its priorities are and whether it's being pulled in different directions or whether it becomes a pawn in sort of games between rival superpowers, which I think is a relatively dangerous situation for a small country to find itself caught up in.
And what are Serbia's priorities at the moment? Politically speaking, in terms of perhaps more foreign policy orientated?
I think in terms of foreign policy, Serbia's foreign policy goal is accession of the European Union. But I think the Serbian leadership is also trying to maintain a balancing act and maintain good relations with Russia, as well as other regional or international powers, whether they be Turkey, Gulf states, or China. And I think the other main goal of the Serbian leadership is to attract investment into the country. And in this context, it's very much open to whoever wishes to invest in Serbia in some way, shape, or form.
And Serbia is, from my understanding, the poorest country in the Balkan regions, and this makes it one of the poorer countries in the Balkan region, certainly one that is seeking ascension to the EU. How does this make it vulnerable to increased authoritarianism, as we are seeing in Hungary with Orban and his sort of exile of Soros at the moment?
Well, we have a clear rise. There's a clear sort of authoritarian regression in this country, particularly since around 2012, when the current ruling party came to power. This is reflected in various international studies and monitoring reports from Freedom House to Reporters Without Borders. And this is a constant problem in Serbia. I don't think that China necessarily... I don't think China is in any way crucial to propping up the kind of more authoritarian model of rule that this government has promoted and developed. China, has its investment projects here, its own interests. It doesn't necessarily really get involved, I think, too much in who's in charge in Serbia or how they rule. I don't think they're particularly interested in that, whether they rule more or less democratically. They're simply interested in increasing their own influence and increasing the ties between China and this country, as well as the entire region. It's not just this country. This country is a relatively small country for China from the point of view of a big country like China.
And focusing more on the journalism aspect and some of the stuff you do here, could you expand on your specific goals as an organisation and what you are focusing on at the moment? Is there any specific projects you're looking at?
We have many different projects which Bern is engaged in. I'm actually not a journalist, so I work in a different part of the company, so I'm probably not best positioned to talk about that. But I think in general, the organization's among its goals are improving transparency and accountability in the country, and in a sort of wider sense, holding the government to account in the context of this. I think, any kind of big infrastructure projects or investments are certainly something that would be of interest to us, particularly if there are transparency issues related to those projects.
And you're not aware of any large-scale infrastructure projects that Bern is investigating or looking into at the moment?
I couldn't comment on that, yeah.
And from my understanding, Bern is funded by largely Western organisations, may that be I think sort of the US, Finland, and some other ones.
We have a range of very typical donors who fund civil society and independent media across Eastern Europe.
And how does that play into sort of Bern's agenda as an organisation?
I don't think that plays in any particular way into any kind of agenda. Bern is funded by various international, governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations, and it's funded to provide good quality independent journalism in the region. And I don't think there's a sort of particular agenda or focus that comes from that direction.
And in the last 5 years, what do you think has been one of the most important sort of uncoverings that Bern has been involved in? So I know recently, for example, one of your reports into British arms dealings has sort of had quite a large impact. Are there other projects that you'd like to elaborate?
I think that the project which looked into the arms trade and particularly about how weapons end up in the Middle East has been a project that has gained a particularly great deal of international attention. Yeah.
And Bern is, of course, not just focused on Serbia; it's focused on the Balkan region as a whole.
Yeah, that's right.
How does your engagement differ between the different players within the region? How do you deal with some of the different barriers which there may be in terms of connecting the dots when you're focusing on investigations which involve more than one country?
A lot of the times investigations are more inwardly focused within countries, but I think that's one of the advantages of Bern and the particular situation that we're in, that we are able to overcome those barriers more easily than other organizations because we have a network across the region, which potentially is very interesting and very useful when you have big projects like the Chinese involvement in the region, for example. So yeah.
And in terms of, would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on this network in terms of maybe some of the linguistic diversity you have in your team, the academic expertise? What specific coverage do you have in that regard?
We have a very wide range of expertise in our network. I think the linguistic problems are not really that big because we cover, the big chunk of what we cover is the ex-Yugoslav space. That's a good proportion of it, and I think there's still quite a lot of common linguistic and cultural and all sorts of other links in that region, and ultimately, most of the people in the organization also speak English, so I don't think that's ever really been a problem in that sense. Yeah.
And of course, some of the Balkan region is ex of Soviet and ex communist territory. How does that interact and coexist with the ambitions of countries like Serbia to move towards a more modern liberal sort of democracy? Like
in all transitional countries, I think you have the communist legacy and the communist past and all the issues that comes with. But communism fell a good 28 years ago, let's say. There are whole generations which have become adults since then and have grown up. And I think the transitions have progressed and gone a long way, and now we're just now we're evolving. All of these countries are evolving into new systems. They all sort of had, to some extent, common starting points when they embarked on their transitions, but also different starting points. But they sort of followed a broadly similar trajectory. But then afterwards, they did start diverging increasingly. So I think we're now seeing these countries following quite different trajectories. And
you mentioned earlier before we started about the Belgrade-Budapest railway line, and this is one of the sort of the signature investments and developments in the region. From my understanding, the Chinese seem to be gaining the most from this project, maybe in terms of links with transport corridors in Piraeus, or in terms of loans or the use of workers and other sort of economic incentives. What do you think Serbia has to gain, and why has it been so enthusiastic in partaking in this project?
That's a very good question. I think China has a very clear interest in developing transport corridors from big ports like Piraeus, which can potentially transport its goods onwards towards the rest of Europe. And the Belgrade-Budapest line certainly fits into that. So I think China has very serious long-term plans and or strategies and medium and short-term plans for developing them and implementing them. And it makes perfect sense from China's point of view to invest in high-speed railway lines connecting Belgrade and Budapest and other parts of Europe. For Serbia, it's a slightly different situation. Serbia is the government is very happy to take on big investment projects. But I think there's a real problem in terms of whether anyone is doing cost-benefit analysis of particular projects. So, for example, as far as I know, the Belgrade-Budapest railway line is not going to be funded by China or built by China. It's going to be funded through bilateral loans, which Serbia will have to repay. Chinese companies and engineers and workers will carry out a lot of the construction work. So essentially, Serbia is going to be paying for this line with the assistance of a Chinese loan. Now, it's very questionable to me whether anyone in Serbia has done a real cost-benefit analysis of whether Serbia itself needs this railway line, whether this is a priority for Serbia. Do Serbian goods, do Serbian exports go towards Europe via this line? Will they ever go to the EU via this line, or will they go through other routes? So what will Serbia's interest be in actually constructing and paying for this railway line? And also, does Serbia have more pressing priorities than this? So I think China has a very kind of long-term view in our agenda, and Serbian leadership and Serbian political leaders have a much more short-term tactical horizon, where their interest is to sort of be photographed, seen to be cutting red ribbons, to be able to present themselves as carrying out big investment projects, which may look good from day-to-day news bulletins from one election campaign to another, but it's really questionable whether this is meeting Serbia's real priorities. And there's also the issue of transparency, I think, with projects like this. As I said, Chinese companies carry out most of the work, yet Serbia is the one ultimately paying for it, even if we do get loans from China to carry out these kind of projects. The transparency issue also brings us into a certain amount of conflict, probably with the European Union, because as I'm sure that the EU has issues with the way that the construction of the railway line was going to be carried out, and has essentially blocked its construction on the Hungarian side. It's potentially bringing us into a kind of discrepancy or problem in terms of our own accession process, depending on how this process goes.
And as you mentioned, the tender has been made public on the Hungarian side. Has there been any development on the Serbian side?
In all honesty, I haven't followed the project on the Serbian side in particular detail, so I'm not sure where it's got to at this stage. So I'd rather not.
Of course, no.
Yeah.
And you mentioned some of the wider issues in Serbia. Would you be happy to expand on this, and perhaps extrapolating from that, do you think Serbia's internal infrastructure issues are being neglected at the expense of as a sort of a hallmark investment?
I certainly think that Serbia doesn't have a clearly defined plan or plan of priorities of what the most immediate priorities are for developing in terms of infrastructure, what it needs, what its interests are. So when someone comes along and offers some big glitzy project, politicians jump on it because it's good from a sort of PR point of view. It looks good. It plays well with the public, because the idea is that any investment must be a good investment, but that isn't necessarily the case.
What are the general perceptions towards both foreign and specifically Chinese investment in Serbia?
Serbia has relatively low living standards and salaries for a European country, and I think foreign investment is generally welcome here and desirable, and it is supported. I don't think that the public has any particular problem with Chinese investments as such. I don't think they perceive Chinese investments as being any more or less benevolent or non-benevolent than other investments. And I think because of Serbia's particular history during the 1990s and 2000s and a great deal of conditionality that has been imposed, I almost think that the average member of the public would possibly even think that Chinese investments are less conditioned and maybe even more benevolent than investments from other parts of the countries. For example, when foreign officials come to Serbia, Chinese foreign officials will typically sort of praise traditionally good relations between Serbia and China, say lots of nice things, not really criticize very much, particularly not in public, whereas Western officials are much more likely to sort of be more frank and open about what they see as the problems in Serbia in terms of governance or over other issues. So I think that is why. That's a good reason for why the public does not have a particularly negative perception of Chinese investments.
And of course, there's the economic motivation for investing in Serbia. Do you see there being other reasons for Chinese investment in this country?
So economic.
So there's of course the economic reasons for investing in this country. I mean, I know Xi Jinping, when he came here, they took over the steel mill at
Smederevo, I think China is interested in expanding its political and diplomatic footprint and expanding those links, increasing its leverage, simply increasing its presence. So I think the economic and the political in China's thinking probably goes hand in hand. I don't think there's anything much more to it than that, really.
I agree.
Yeah.
And in terms of...
And I would say China is not behaving any differently than any other big power, regional or international.
And in terms of the transition, as we touched on earlier, from a sort of post-communist state to perhaps something more, how has Serbia's transition differed from that of other Balkan actors and players?
Well, Serbia's transition has a lot in common with other countries in the region, which were other countries of the former Yugoslavia, which were caught up in a sort of the transitions occurred in the context of the disintegration of the federal state. They occurred in many cases in the context of wars or civil wars, which were either played out on the territory of those countries or other countries such as Serbia were involved in. So these were very complex transitions. There were multiple transitions going on at the same time. I think other countries like Bulgaria and Romania had transitions which were much more similar to other East European countries like maybe Poland or Czech and Slovak republics, whereas the countries of the former Yugoslavia really had very specific transitions, and they also had kind of stop-start transitions. Those transitions didn't necessarily immediately lead to... They weren't immediately transitions towards democracy. They were transitions, in many cases, to new forms of authoritarianism. And then there was a second wave of transitions from around 2000, where we actually had more movement towards something that was more like a liberal democracy. And then since about, since 2010, 2012, we've seen across the region this kind of democratic regression, backsliding, drift towards a more authoritarian model of politics. Stabilocracy is a term that is often used to refer to the Balkans in terms of this kind of strong local rulers who overstep the democratic rules of the game, but are not necessarily sanctioned for it by the EU or other international actors, because stability is the key game in town.
And of course, the press freedoms, both internationally and the region, have declined in the last 3 years, but also pretty gradually over the last 10 years. And there's been a general apathy in the public circles towards this. Why do you think this is?
Apathy in public circles towards declining media freedom.
Yes.
I don't think there's been apathy in the public here in Serbia. I think a significant proportion of the public is very aware of what's been happening. There have even been protests at times, but the public is very limited in what it can ultimately do, particularly in the situation where you have one ruling party which is exceptionally strong, a very weak opposition. I wouldn't say that the Serbian public has necessarily been apathetic towards the state of media freedom. Certainly, a significant proportion of the public is, but I'm not sure to what extent you can ever expect the entire public to be mobilized about media freedoms, particularly when you have a lot of people who are very much struggling to make ends meet in this country, and they have much more core sort of economic bread and butter issues that they're concerned about.
And what are the risks to Bern, and also, if you're happy to discuss on a personal level, of being involved in a media organisation like this in a country such as Serbia? I'm not best positioned to talk about that, probably. I think there are risks and there are problems.
and the government has certainly gone after independent media organizations. There have certainly been many attacks through pro-government media on organizations such as Bern and various other independent media organizations. So yeah, I would say it's not an easy position and an easy role to be in.
And so how has Serbia's relationship with Kosovo developed?
This is one of the most complex relationships that Serbia has. I think that Kosovo is probably one of the biggest challenges that this government is facing. It's under a lot of pressure to sign a legal binding agreement on governing relations between Serbia and Kosovo. I think there is a great deal of opposition in the country towards this. It's a very emotive issue in Serbia, and I think it's very hard to conduct a calm, rational conversation about that. So, remains to be seen. Ambitious?
And what do you think the greatest challenge Serbia faces in the next 5 years?
I personally think that the biggest challenges relate to governance, rule of law, corruption, to socioeconomic development, and to demographic problems. This entire region is... people are voting with their feet. They're leaving, especially the most educated, competent, capable people. They are leaving towards Western Europe, that people are trying to leave. And I think this is the greatest challenge that this region faces, to provide the kind of levels of development that people will not seek to emigrate in such high numbers, but also to provide reasonably well-governed countries that will not, so that this will not be a factor driving people to emigrate from the region.
And I know it's not your expertise, but if you were happy to sum up the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, what would that word be to you?
Ambitious?